Today we are working on the second half of chapter 3, and it's a very interesting subject and one that a lot of us are not really aware of the power it has over our lives, and is just inherent and crucial to holding societies together. And that is norms in particular. Uh, Symbols are important in language, but it's norms that are really the crucial thing. So let's go through this, and I think you'll begin to understand how important it is. For example, the behaviors we saw at the Capitol on January 6th were not normal. They did not follow the both formal norms, when we'll talk about what those are in a moment, and the informal norms of civil society in a democracy. And it was shocking to many people, at least the majority of Americans from polling and research, to see people behave that way, because it was we'll talk about this a little bit more, it was deviant. It was not following the norms or the rules. That's an extreme example, and we'll look at others as we go through this learning process today, but that's the most recent powerful one that I can think of that you can get an example. So norms, are the expectation of right behavior. You could put right in quotes. They vary dramatically and widely from culture to culture. But whatever culture you're in, there are rules that underlie how people are expected to behave. They're visible and invisible rules of conduct through which, this is a key point, society is structured. So when those rules and norms fail, the structure of society can fail, and certainly begin to feel like it's failing, like there's a crisis, like no one knows, the center does not hold, as they say. It's just chaos. So that's one, the visible and invisible rules of conduct through which society is structured. That's one component of norms. Norms define how to behave in accordance with what is good, right, important, expected, and yes, normal, underlined in your own, whatever your society is, okay? And the third component of this is that most members conform. Most members of societies adhere to them, because if you don't adhere to them, you are a deviant. I think I mentioned this in another lecture, maybe it was in another course, that we think of deviant, just the way we use the terminology in general language, very differently than the way sociologists and social scientists think about it. A deviant is just someone who doesn't follow the rules. If you cheat on a test, you're a deviant. Okay, if you race through a red light, whatever, drive while you're drunk, drinking, etc. Those are deviant behaviors, and they're deviant because they're deviating, which is what a deviance is. They're deviating from the rules, from the norms of society. I mentioned from the expectations. So that's a deviant is a person who violates the norms, rules, or expectations. I talked about elevator behavior, I believe, in last week, and that's an example of it, going into an elevator and behaving in a completely different way than is socially acceptable. And so there are two kinds of norms. Formal norms. Formal norms are established and written rules, and that's why they're called formal. Okay? So laws are an example of formal norms. Employee manuals, the SWOC policies that you see at the end of the syllabi are formal norms, what you can and cannot do, what is acceptable and not acceptable. So college entrance exams and requirements are formal norms. On a lighter note, you know, as your text says, no running signs at swimming pools. It's written down, it's posted, and if you don't follow them, there usually will be some kind of consequences, even if it's just someone saying, hey, didn't you see that you're not supposed to run around the pool? Okay. And the norms that are most clearly stated in laws, for example, are also the most clearly and stringently enforced through arrests, going to jail, being fired, being kicked out of school, etc., etc. Now, I said there were two kinds of norms, and formal is the kind I just described, written rules and written consequences. But there are, you know, the most of the norms that we deal with on a daily micro level are informal norms. And those are casual behaviors that are acceptable and widely conformed to. And the way we learn them is by observation, imitation, socialization. Okay, so we watch what other people are doing and we figure out what the appropriate behavior is. But especially when we're young, they can also be taught directly. So I'm sure some of you have heard some adult in your life and you were a child tell you not to stare, that's rude, to share your toys, right? To use your napkin. There's a variety of other ones that we could go into. But those are informal norms. You're not going to go to jail if you break them, right? And yet they're stated because they're very important for how we are perceived in society by others, how, you know, they reflect on our family of origin and on our parents when we're little, those kinds of behaviors and that sort of thing. So other informal norms, as I said, are learned by observation. And part of that observation is learning the consequences by observation of not conforming or violating a norm. So nobody likes Johnny because he's selfish and he won't share his toys. Okay. So that's another way to learn to share, is to observe the consequences of what's happening with someone else. And although those informal norms govern personal interactions, and they also extend to other systems. So one of the examples your text gave you is going out to eat in a fast food restaurant. We all know what we're supposed to do. You know, we get in line, you know, we order, we get out of the way as fast as possible. Before we leave, we take our napkins and baskets and things and remove them from the table and put them where they're supposed to go, that type of thing. Elevator behavior is another one. You walk in, you know, you face forward, you don't face the back of the elevator, you don't talk to people, you leave a lot of space, et cetera, et cetera. That's another one. So these are other systems when we're out in the world. If you need to line up in many cases at different offices, the DMV, you know, there's a variety of offices and institutions where lining up is important, that type of thing. Being on time is another one. You know, that's another one that's very important in our culture. Breaching experiments are when people do the opposite, where they break some of those norms. And the research is about how societal rules and norms not only influence our behavior, which they do, our personal behavior, but they shape social order. So part of the research they wanted to discover how people's assumptions about how things are going to work, you know, make up shape the social makeup of their communities. So a breaching experiment is when someone acts in a way that's different than the accepted social norms and conformity. I've talked about the elevator behavior, okay. Another one is when, I think I mentioned this in this course once again, it's hard to remember, but when in our interpersonal communication class when I was in graduate school, because we have very small personal space with each other. The instructor it was a breaching experiment. The person that the experiment was being done to didn't know it was being done to them, but everybody else did. And one of the students got in closer and closer and closer to their personal space while talking to them, and that person kept backing up and backing up and backing up until they bumped into a wall. Well, that's an example of a breaching experience. You're breaching the norms of society, and researchers do that to see how that keeps society integrated and whole. Another one that happened to me on campus years ago was my office was in Lamp, and I was walking over to Stensland where all the classes are, and I walked around the back way, around back where the pond is back there, and you walk down that long path coming towards Stensland, and the gym is straight at the end of that path. So I was actually going back to my office. I was leaving Stensland, walking down that path towards the gym, walking on the right side of the road, which is to us both the physically right side and also the correct right side. And this student came walking towards me, and he was walking in the wrong lane. Instead of walking on his right, he was walking on his left, and he was going to run directly into me. And I watched him from that long distance of that straight path out there, thinking, this is a game of chicken, and he's eventually going to move. And first I thought he just wasn't aware of what was going on and didn't see me. Then it was obvious. We got closer. He did see me. And so I couldn't figure out what the heck was going on. It's very disorienting and discombobulating when things like that happen. And eventually I moved over because we were going to collide if I didn't. So that's another. Did it make me uncomfortable? Yes. Yes, it did. And so that's what, when you breach those norms, it kind of makes the fabric of the social structure begin to unravel. Once again, I want to go back to January 6th. That, had it been an experiment, was a major breaching experiment. It breached all the rules, all the norms, and the fabric of society and normality began to collapse. So that's what they are. The reactions are often outrage to those, when researchers do that on purpose with breaching experiences, outrage, anger, puzzlement, fear, other emotions can come up. And those experiments, or when we see them in real time, as we did, as I keep saying, on January 6th, it demonstrates how powerful norms are to our social life. There are guides, they're powerful guides, deeply ingrained and embedded in us, so that we aren't consciously aware of for the most part until they're breached, until they're broken, and we see it. So they let us know the key to these norms and informal norms in particular is that they let us know how to behave and how to feel comfortable and what's appropriate. There are also, within that category, norms, mores, and folkways. Mores are norms that are really strictly enforced because they're thought to be essential to the core values of a society and the well-being of a group. And violating mores can have very serious consequences. The very strongest mores are protected by laws and other formal means. For instance, murder is a more. You don't kill somebody else, and that's, the powerful consequences of that generally. But more often they're judged and guarded by public sentiment. So that's kind of the informal norm part of it. So people who violate mores, those really powerful rules, the big rules, are seen as shameful. In some groups, they're banished, they're shunned, and in some places stoned, right? Or have a hand cut off. Think about some Muslim countries, the stoning, the beheading, the hands cut off. That's for violating some pretty powerful mores. And the next thing your book says is the consequences can be severe. Yes, they can. I just gave you some examples. Now, folkways are norms that are very interesting because they're not strictly enforced and they don't necessarily have moral foundations. That's what makes them a little bit different. Most mores, you can think of the Ten Commandments. They have moral underpinnings to them. But folkways kind of direct appropriate behavior in day-to-day interactions. So one of the ways that folkways are rules, but they're not rules that you get in horrible trouble for generally, is appropriate clothing. What's appropriate clothing? What's appropriate for women to wear in the U.S. is extremely different than what's appropriate for women to wear in many other countries of the world, where veiling or covering the body completely is very, very, very important. Even in the U.S., there are appropriate times to wear certain kinds of clothing and times when that's not appropriate to wear. Okay. There was a period of time when students, particularly young women, would show, I can remember this several years ago, show up in class with pajama bottoms and slippers. And, to me, for my generation, man, that is totally inappropriate. I'm conscious enough to understand that the mores or the folkways have changed. Even wearing, going to Catholic churches historically. No sleeveless clothing. You covered your head if you were female, those types of things. So those are ideas of folkways. You don't get in deep trouble for violating them, but, they do make people stop and think a little bit about, hey, what's going on with them, So there's that. And then folkways are kind of taken for granted behavior, and there's many of them are the basis for culture shock. We talked to getting too close to somebody or weird food, those types of things are like folkways. So here's how the sociologist Ian Robertson put it, as quoted in your book: a man who walks down the street wearing nothing on the upper half of his body is violating a folkway. And I would make an aside here, an exception, unless he's at the beach. Okay, but if he's walking down a busy street in a city with no shirt on, he's violating a folkway. But if he walks down that same street with nothing on his bottom half, then he's violating a more, one of our most strictest and important mores, the requirement that people cover their genitals and buttocks. So it works that way. You get the point. So the situation and just a slight tweak of it in a folkway can change the behavior. There used to be, I don't know if you're all young enough to remember the streaking craze. So people would run naked through some event. And in the old sociology textbook I used to do, there was this great photograph. I was going to look and see if I could find a photograph to put up on the page for you, and I might on the additional material still today. It's a young man in Britain running through I don't know if it's a soccer game or what kind of game it is, but he's stark naked. And the bobbies, the British police, have caught him, and they're one on either side of him, taking him off the playing field. One of the bobbies puts his helmet, bobbies, British police have those rounded type helmets over his genitals, and both the police are cracking up. Well, that's a folkway, okay? It's one of the more serious folkways that he's violated, but it's still, people look at it, and I'm sure the crowd was cheering and laughing and think it's very funny. Okay. Now, a taboo is not funny. Okay, a taboo is a norm. That's the strongest kind of a norm, and it is usually causes revulsion in the society. So cannibalism in Western society. I mean, yes, there are some indigenous people who partake in cannibalism, but let's say in Western society, cannibalism is one. Incest is another one. Those are two examples of two major taboos. A person who breaks a taboo in a society is often deemed not fit to live in the same society as others, and they are completely rejected. They're either imprisoned for life or banished or killed or whatever. The sanctions are very, very, very severe, as I just described. Another interesting thing, now these two, taboos and moral holidays are not in your text, but they're very important aspects of norms. So I wanted to cover them with you so that you can understand them, because moral holidays are kind of a fun thing to think about. And what is that? That is, and that's a technical term in sociology when you're talking about norms. There's moral holidays, and you can tell by the terminology, right? Okay, there's a certain time period or certain place where we're going to say, you can have a lot more leeway of doing certain things than you normally can in normal times and places. So there's specified times when people are allowed to break norms. So Mardi Gras is an example. It's public drunkenness is accepted, rowdiness, carrying on, some nudity is accepted. For years I didn't know what people were driving around in their cars with those beads around their rearview mirrors till I found out that it's women who go topless in the parades and down the streets and just observers of the parade at Mardi Gras time in New Orleans. Well, any other time they'd be arrested, right? You don't go around as a female without your top on, bare-chested. But in Mardi Gras time, you get positive sanctions for doing it. You get beads. It's kind of funny. And the police, the other thing about moral holidays is that, they have to get really out of hand before the police ever step in. Sometimes moral holidays are more like moral holiday places. And one of the examples the other text gives is red light districts. This is where the prostitutes are, and the police don't really interfere too much in those areas. There's a party cove it's called the Party Cove, that's the name of it, at the Lake of the Ozarks in Missouri. Which is it's a very straight-laced community normally, and Missouri is pretty straight-laced in and of itself, the whole state. But every summer, hundreds of boaters show up there. They moor their vessels together. They get drunk, run around naked. They even water ski naked, dance to loud music, et cetera, et cetera. And the police never intervene. The Missouri Water Patrol never arrests anybody or goes in there. And what their rationale is, because they have to have the Missouri Water Police, their rationale is that they gave the green light to the Party Cove. Basically, they said the officers don't enter the cove, and their supposed reason is, their rationale is that it's just too congested for them to get to the problem in time. Another example of a moral holiday that's a time and a place is spring break. College students go to beaches in Florida and other states and just trash them. They get drunk, they take drugs, they run around naked or topless. And when they leave, there's this huge mess that costs the city or the community money and time and energy to go and clean up, because they never clean up any of the messes. There's just piles of all kinds of things left. And yet, now in more recent years, cities have said, we don't want you here. But for, a couple of generations that was going on, and nobody stopped it. The police didn't come. And mostly it was because it brought money into the community. So that's what norms are. Formal, informal, mores, folkways, and taboo. Okay, so now we're going to move into attitudes. And the rest of this chapter deals with attitudes kind of in almost too much detail, I think, and ad infinitum, but we'll get into it because they're very important. And attitudes create values they're interactive. Values create attitudes, attitudes create values, but they're really important. So attitudes are mostly enduring. Usually once we have an attitude, we don't change it. They're enduring, mostly enduring evaluations of something where the something that we have the attitude towards or about is called an attitude object. So remember that as I move through this, because that term is used a lot. So an attitude object could be, do you prefer Pepsi or Coke? You know, that's a very funny one, because people have such strong attitudes about Pepsi or Coke. Well, when they do the research and blindfold people, taste tests, they can't tell the difference. So most of them, I mean, I'm sure some can, but the majority do not. So that's what an attitude is. And the attitude object in that case was, what's your attitude? Which soft drink do you prefer? Okay. So as you can see from that example, attitudes are evaluations of things, and their preferences it could be for an attitude object, obviously, or against an attitude object. So the preferences are how that works is what we prefer, what we like, what we dislike, what we hate, what we love. Have you ever said, oh, I hate that, whatever that food is or something, or that kind of car or whatever. Or I just love that, whatever. That's attitude, and evaluating something, and whatever it is you hate or love is the attitude object. So when we state our preferences, as I just described, we're expressing the relationship, which is either positive or negative, between ourselves and that object. And you'll see as we get through this, it can be an idea, it can be a philosophy, as we get into politics here in a minute about that. But it's that, what are our preferences that are strongly held, usually, not always, there are two kinds of attitudes, some that are strong and some that are weaker, about what we like or don't like. And, it can be either positive or negative between the self and the attitude object. So can you see how that's a very important part of our self-concept? Have any of you ever said, I wouldn't be caught dead either wearing that thing, listening to that kind of music, driving that kind of car, that type of thing, or going into that particular venue, So our self-concept is really tied up with our attitudes, which are evaluations. So we all have thousands and thousands of attitudes about things like family and friends, political parties and political figures, abortion rights, terrorism, preferences for music and art, all those types of things. So what the research shows is that some of our attitudes are inherited. Now, isn't this interesting? I want to underline the some, and I want to underline the next part, which is that they're partially inherited. So some of our attitudes are inherited, at least in part, through genetic transmission from our parents. Now, any social scientist is pretty much going to tell you that nurture trumps nature. That socialization generally is more powerful than genetic influences and things of that nature, unless we're talking about illness, pathologies, physical pathologies. Okay. So, but you can see the chart under text, the interesting things from the things that are the most affected by genetic inheritance and the attitudes that are least inherited. And it's pretty fascinating. I hope that you read through that and look at it. So some are partially, apparently, genetically transmitted from our parents. Other attitudes are learned. And most of our attitudes are learned through direct and indirect experiences, with whatever the attitude objects are. It's what we've been told and taught about them. So to a great extent, it's who we listen to, right? Okay. Now, when you're a child, you don't have any choice about who you listen to. This is where the earliest attitudes about race are formed. Okay. They're very strongly held. Very strongly held. Those attitudes are learned through our socialization and through direct and indirect experience with the attitude objects, or what we've been told about them, as I just said. Now, interestingly, there's a thrill-seeking gene, and you can Google it. There's a ton of articles online about the thrill-seeking gene. And so an example of that, as it points out in your text, is roller coaster. There are people who just love roller coasters, and people like me who do not have a thrill-seeking gene. I don't have one iota of a thrill-seeking gene. So maybe it is really genetic, right? But I never really had an exposure as a child either to anything that you would call thrill-seeking in that sense. So that the people who love roller coaster rides, people who love to go really fast or take chances, those types of things, mountain climbers, there's a thrill-seeking gene. So that's one way. Also, our attitudes are learned through media. Think about how media and advertising influences your choices. It's just unbelievable when you think about it, So it's learned through media, friends, interaction with friends, and a lot, to go back to what I said about race in particular and ethnicity, through our early socialization. That's not the only place we learn what we like to eat and what we don't like to eat, and what's the right religion or the right political party. All of those things we learn through socialization early on. Some of those attitudes that we have are shared by others that are pretty widespread. Most people like sweet things, right? Maybe that's genetic for everybody. Sugar is generally liked by most people. Most people fear snakes. More people do than don't. Let's put it that way from the research. Fear snakes, don't like snakes, and are disgusted by cockroaches. These are just examples, rats, things like that. Now, that's all based on research. It doesn't mean everyone feels that way. It means a majority of people share those attitudes. But other attitudes, people don't share as much. They're much more personal. And that, once again, is your taste in music and art and clothes and, decor and all kinds. There are many, many things other than just art things. But you get that point there. Those are very personal feelings, attitudes, I should say. So be sure and look at that heritability chart, because it's extremely interesting. So now we're going to look at the three components of attitudes, which is cognitive, which means your thinking brain. Affective means how you feel about something. And behavioral, which is what do you actually do about those attitudes, And I think that the chocolate ice cream example in your text is a good one. Your author loves chocolate ice cream. So the affective or feeling part of his attitude is, I love it. I just love it, right? The behavior that goes along with that is, I eat a lot. I frequently eat it. And then the cognitive part, where you kind of parse, well, why do I like it? Well, chocolate ice cream has a smooth texture and a rich, strong taste. Okay. Can you see how it involves preference? Okay. So almost all attitudes are determined by those three components: cognition, affect, and behavior. There's some variability, of course, across people and across attitudes. So some attitudes are more often based on beliefs and some more on feelings and on behaviors. Okay. So chocolate ice cream, that kind of thing is more by affect. I just like it, right? But then your author points out towards his car and his home air conditioner, it's more cognitive. I like it because it does something for me, okay? Um, so it and with cognitive stuff, it isn't necessarily you like it, but you admire it, right? Or you understand its value based on what it does. So in the case of the car, he admires its positive features, right? Good gas mileage, etc. And he admires the positive features of the air conditioner and that it keeps him cool. Can you see how that's a cognitive, intellectual process as opposed to, I just like it, I don't know why, but, I do. Now, towards his neighbors, the example that the text gives, the author, is that's more behavioral. They actually do things for each other, Maybe they'll collect the neighbor's mail when they're on vacation, for example, or in a crisis, babysit a child or something. Those are behaviors, and as opposed to intellectual understanding of why you like something, or I just love my neighbors, kind of thing. Okay, so different people hold different attitudes towards this same attitude object for different reasons. Okay, so there are people who have the same attitude about an object, an attitude object for different reasons. Okay, they use people who voted for President Obama. When they did the research that was done on that, some voted for or against him because of his policies. That's cognition. I know what he wants to do, and I think it's great, so I'm going to vote for him. I've intellectualized what it is he wants to do. I know what he wants to do, and I don't like any of those policies, so I'm going to vote against him. So that's cognition, okay? So you would assume that cognition would be the most important. But political science and people vote for, but no, it's not. And I think most of us intuitively know this. I don't know how many of you actually read party platforms, or, we had a chapter on politics last week in sociology, and I suggested that people do that. Just it's very clearly stated what the parties stand for. How many people who vote do that? So it turns out that political science research shows that voting decisions are more based on feeling. They're more effective. I like this person. I hate this person, right? Which with President Obama was basically very extreme, more than he's okay. No, people had very strong feelings about him. So they're much more effective. Now, here's the other thing. Effective components are usually the strongest and most important component of attitudes, okay? So of the other two, cognition, which is understanding why we like or don't like something intellectually, or behaving in a certain way about it, it's how we feel that affects the strength of our emotions the most, or our values, I should say, attitudes. So we hold attitudes because they're useful. They help us to know what behaviors to engage in, which people to approach, which people to avoid, which products to buy, that type of thing. And because they're evaluations, they can be assessed by facial expressions and arousal. Once again, disgust and fear you can see in people's faces if you expose them to rats or something of that nature, or snakes, if that's where their fear comes from. You can actually see the attitude expressed in facial expressions. So some attitudes are stronger than others. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but we'll go into it in more detail now. And some are stronger than others, often because they're more important and more useful than other attitudes. They have, because they have more impact on our daily lives. And the terminology here is attitude strength. So they're very strong attitudes. They're important. Here's a key point. We hold them with confidence. We rarely question them. We don't like it when other people challenge them. Can you see why political discussions are often difficult, or trying to convince somebody differently, or religious ones? Because man, these are attitudes that have attitude strength, okay? And we hold them with confidence. We usually don't change them very much over our lifetimes, and we use them frequently to guide our actions. So the thing, though, that's the problem with them is that they often guide our actions in a way that's completely out of our awareness. So we think we've done the cognition about who to vote for, right? But we haven't. We're just basing it on very powerful attitudes, attitude strength, okay? Other attitudes are weaker, and they don't have as much influence on our actions as the ones that have attitude strength. You can kind of, go along with something, if they're weaker attitudes. But strong attitudes are more cognitively accessible. They come to mind quickly, regularly. Oh, I hate that, or I hate him, or I don't like that, whatever. If we state an attitude quickly, it's usually a strong one. If we feel strongly about something and we state it quickly, it's usually a strong one. If we're unsure and we say, oh, I don't know, I have to think about how I feel about that, that's a weak attitude. I'm sure you could see that if you say, well, I don't know if I like that or I don't, or if I'm going to go do that or not, I have to think about it, okay? That's a weak attitude. Attitudes become stronger when they have a direct positive, when we have direct positive or negative experiences with them. Well, yes, I would say so. So because attitude strength determines cognitive accessibility, it's possible to make attitude stronger by increasing the accessibility of it, okay? So if you have people think about or express out loud their attitudes, they become stronger than if they're not verbalized, if they're just kind of floating around in your brain. And they're also stronger when all of those ABCs, attitude, behavior, affect, behavior, cognition, all line up, okay? When they're all pretty equal and they're all present, then those are stronger attitudes. So when do attitudes change our behaviors is an interesting question. There's generally consistency between attitudes and behavior based on how strong the relationship in certain situations are. So there are certain situations, it varies for each of us, where those attitudes really affect our behavior. There's certain people that affect our behavior. We could talk about race again and ethnicity. So those attitudes that correlate with things that kind of push our buttons, either positively or negatively, can change our behavior. So once again, just to wrap this up, attitudes that are strong predict behavior better than weak attitudes. People with a strong attitude towards an attitude object are more likely to have strong interactions and to engage in activity it's a really powerful predictor of behavior. People with strong attitudes towards something, or you could predict their behavior about that particular attitude object. All right, we're through for today. I'm going to try and put up some additional sites for you to look at today about the thrill-seeking gene. So anyway, that's it.